I learned in the most brutal way possible that the people who claim to love you can become the architects of your greatest betrayals. And that realization arrived on a quiet evening when I stepped into my apartment expecting nothing more than dinner and rest, only to walk into a scene that would shatter the life I thought I was building. The woman I planned to marry was sitting on the edge of the couch with swollen eyes and streaked makeup, her hands folded tightly in her lap as if she were trying to hold herself together, while my own mother sat beside her, one arm wrapped around her shoulders in what looked like a gesture of comfort, but felt, even from the doorway, like something far more calculated and sinister. I froze in place, grocery bags cutting into my fingers, listening as my mother spoke in a soft, persuasive voice that carried through the room, telling my partner that I would never be able to give her the life she deserved, that I was wasting my education chasing illusions, that my long nights working on my business were proof of irresponsibility rather than dedication. She painted a future for her that was filled with uncertainty, stress, and disappointment if she stayed with me, while describing another future that was safe, wealthy, and socially impressive if she chose someone else, someone from our own bloodline who supposedly had stability and influence. The most painful part wasn't just hearing those words, but watching the woman I loved nod slowly as if each sentence made sense, her eyes shifting between my mother's face and the floor, never once questioning the cruelty of what was being said or the betrayal it represented. I realized in that moment that the people I trusted most were quietly rewriting my story without me, and I stood there in silence, unseen and unheard, while the foundation of my life collapsed around me. I didn't confront them, didn't burst into the room, didn't ask for explanations or beg for honesty, because something inside me hardened the moment I understood that their decision had already been made without my consent. Instead, I stepped back into the hallway, closed the door as softly as I could, and walked away carrying a pain so heavy it felt like it would pull me into the ground. That night I checked into a modest hotel on the other side of the city, blocked every number connected to that apartment, and let my attorney handle what little remained of that life. The engagement was dissolved, shared finances were separated, and the ring that once symbolized everything I thought I wanted was returned in a plain envelope left at my mother's doorstep without a word. Within a few days, I packed only what I needed, placed the rest in storage, and relocated to another city where my business partner was based, cutting ties not just with people, but with the version of myself that had believed loyalty was guaranteed by blood and promises. I disappeared completely, not as an act of revenge, but as an act of survival, because staying would have meant drowning in a world where I was already considered disposable. The silence that followed was terrifying and freeing at the same time, and in that emptiness, I discovered a clarity I had never known before, one that forced me to confront my own worth without relying on anyone else's approval. My company had been nothing more than a risky idea for years, a platform designed to connect elite service providers with high-end clients, and it had been dismissed by everyone who mattered in my old life, including the two people who should have believed in me most. But in that new city, surrounded by people who saw possibility instead of failure, I threw myself into the work with a relentless intensity that left no room for self-pity. I spent endless hours refining pitches, studying markets, meeting with investors who had never heard my name and therefore had no reason to doubt me. The hunger to succeed wasn't just professional anymore. It was personal, driven by the need to prove to myself that I was not the weak, impractical man they had described. Slowly, painfully, momentum began to build, and when our first major investor signed on, I felt something shift inside me, a quiet certainty that I was no longer running from my past, but toward a future I had earned. Partnerships followed, stretching across borders and industries, and for the first time I saw my vision taking shape in ways I had only imagined. The nights were long, the pressure relentless, but every challenge reinforced my belief that the life I was creating was far more authentic than the one that had been taken from me. It was during this period of growth that I met the woman who would change everything again, not through manipulation or doubt, but through understanding and strength. She was brought in as a consultant by one of our investors, and from the moment we began working together, I sensed a depth and clarity in her perspective that set her apart from anyone I had known before. She came from a background of privilege, but she carried herself with humility, never using her status as a shield or a weapon, and she challenged me constantly to think beyond limitations I had unconsciously accepted. Our conversations were intense, thoughtful, and often lasted long after official meetings ended, turning into dinners where we discussed not just business strategies, but the experiences that had shaped us into who we were. She knew about my past, about the betrayal that had forced me to start over, and instead of seeing it as a weakness, she saw it as proof of resilience. Over time, trust grew naturally, built on mutual respect and shared ambition, and what began as professional admiration evolved into something deeply personal, something rooted in the belief that we were stronger together than we could ever be alone. When I asked her to build a life with me, it wasn't through grand gestures or public declarations, but in a quiet moment where I told her that I wanted a partner who believed in growth, honesty, and purpose as fiercely as I did. She said yes without hesitation, and our union was marked by simplicity and intention rather than spectacle, surrounded only by those who genuinely supported us. Together, we continued to expand the company, pushing it beyond what either of us had initially envisioned, transforming it into a global force that attracted attention from the most influential figures in the industry. Every success felt surreal, not because of the wealth or recognition, but because it represented a complete reversal of the narrative that had once been imposed on me. I had gone from being dismissed as unrealistic to standing at the forefront of innovation, proving that perseverance and belief could redefine what seemed impossible. The true test of my transformation came when we decided to host an exclusive event in the city I had once fled, a calculated return that symbolized both closure and triumph. The venue was elegant beyond anything I had experienced before, filled with people who represented the world I had fought to enter, and as I stood beside my wife greeting guests, I felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. Among those invited were two names from my past, included not out of spite, but because I wanted to face what had happened on my own terms, without fear or resentment controlling me. When they arrived, dressed in borrowed confidence and false security, I watched as they took in the atmosphere, unaware of who had created it, and for a moment I felt nothing but calm. The power I held in that room wasn't rooted in revenge, but in the knowledge that I no longer needed their validation to define my success. As I stepped onto the stage to speak, I shared the story of building something from nothing, of surrounding yourself with people who believe in your vision, and of letting go of those who only see your limits. I didn't name them, but I knew they recognized themselves in my words, and when I introduced my wife as both my partner in business and in life, the truth of my journey became undeniable. The shock on their faces confirmed what I already knew. They had misjudged me, and in doing so, they had lost the chance to be part of the life I had created. Yet instead of feeling vindicated, I felt strangely at peace, as if that chapter had finally closed in a way that allowed me to move forward without bitterness. In the days that followed, messages poured in from people who had once doubted me, suddenly eager to reconnect, to apologize, to benefit from what I had built. I ignored them all, choosing instead to protect the life I had fought so hard to create. I realized that forgiveness did not require reconciliation, and that sometimes the healthiest choice is to let go completely, without explanations or second chances. The past no longer held power over me, and the silence I maintained was not a punishment, but a boundary, one that safeguarded the future my wife and I were building together. Looking back, I understand that betrayal, as devastating as it is, can become a catalyst for transformation if you allow it to fuel growth rather than despair. The people who tried to undermine me unknowingly pushed me toward a life that was more fulfilling than anything I had imagined. And for that, I am grateful, not because they were right, but because I refused to let their actions define me. I learned that worth is not measured by others' expectations, but by the courage to pursue your own vision, even when it feels impossibly out of reach. Every morning now, I wake up beside someone who believes in me, in a life shaped by honesty, effort, and mutual respect. And I know that the journey I endured was not a punishment, but a necessary path toward something greater. The story of my past no longer haunts me. It reminds me of how far I have come, of the resilience I discovered within myself, and of the strength that emerges when you choose to rise instead of remain broken. I am no longer defined by who left or who doubted me, but by the life I continue to build, one decision at a time. Time moved forward with a steady confidence that felt foreign to the person I used to be. And as our company grew beyond borders and expectations, so did the life my wife and I were carefully shaping together, one deliberate choice at a time, guided not by fear or validation, but by the quiet assurance that we had earned every step through perseverance and trust. New offices opened in distant cities that once felt like abstract names on maps, and with each expansion came new challenges that tested our endurance, patience, and unity, yet never our commitment to one another or to the vision we shared. Recognition followed in forms that once would have seemed unreachable, but instead of chasing applause, we focused on building something meaningful, something that would outlast trends and temporary admiration, a foundation rooted in integrity rather than ego. I often reflected on the man I had been when everything collapsed, and I barely recognized him now, not because he was weak, but because he had not yet learned how powerful he could be when he stopped seeking approval from those who could never truly see him. As our influence widened, the echoes of my former life attempted to resurface in subtle, desperate ways, through indirect messages, opportunistic business proposals, and emotionally charged letters that tried to rewrite the past as though it had been misunderstood rather than deliberately distorted. I chose not to respond, not out of cruelty, but because engaging would have reopened wounds that had finally healed, and I had come to understand that silence can be the most honest form of closure when words have already been twisted beyond recognition. It wasn't anger that kept me distant, but clarity, a calm understanding that the people who once dismissed my dreams no longer deserved a place in the reality those dreams had created. My focus remained on the present, on nurturing what was real and sustainable, rather than being pulled back into a narrative that no longer belonged to me. One unexpected connection, however, offered perspective without obligation, a reminder that not all bridges from the past were built on deception. A relative who had quietly observed my journey reached out, not seeking favor or advantage, but simply to express pride and understanding. And through our conversations, I gained insight into the insecurities and motivations that had fueled the choices that once hurt me so deeply. This understanding did not excuse what had happened, but it softened the sharp edges of resentment, allowing me to see the situation through a lens of complexity rather than pure betrayal. I realized that fear often disguises itself as control, and that some people cling to what they can manipulate when they cannot face their own uncertainties. That realization brought peace, not because it justified their actions, but because it freed me from carrying their emotional burdens as my own. Months later, our work achieved milestones that confirmed the global reach we had envisioned, and the sense of accomplishment felt deeper than any external validation ever could. We were no longer building to prove a point. We were building because we believed in the impact of what we had created and the community it served. My wife and I found joy in simple routines between long days of strategy and planning, sharing meals, walking through the city, and dreaming about the future we wanted to nurture beyond the boardroom. In those quiet moments, I felt a gratitude that surpassed success itself, knowing that I had found not just professional fulfillment, but a partnership rooted in mutual respect and shared values. The world, however, has a way of circling back, and remnants of my past eventually revealed the consequences of the choices that once seemed so confident and self-assured. Relationships forged through convenience and status began to fracture, and the carefully constructed illusions that had once looked so convincing slowly unraveled under the weight of reality. I learned of these changes not through direct contact, but through distant whispers that reached me without intention. And while I felt no satisfaction in their struggles, I felt an undeniable sense of closure, a quiet confirmation that paths built on fear and deception rarely lead to lasting fulfillment. What surprised me most was not their downfall, but my indifference to it. The emotional storm that once consumed me had long since passed, replaced by a steady calm that allowed me to observe without attachment. I understood then that true freedom comes not from proving others wrong, but from no longer needing to prove anything at all. My life had become a testament to resilience rather than revenge, and that shift in perspective transformed everything, from how I viewed success to how I defined happiness. Together, my wife and I began planning for a future that extended beyond business achievements, focusing on the family and legacy we wanted to build, one rooted in honesty, compassion, and courage. Each new day felt like an opportunity to honor the journey that had brought us here, to embrace the lessons learned through hardship, and to move forward with intention. The pain that once defined my story had evolved into a source of strength, shaping a version of myself that was wiser, steadier, and more grounded than I ever thought possible. Looking back, I see now that the collapse of my old life was not the end, but the beginning of something far more authentic, a chance to rebuild on foundations of truth rather than expectation. The people who once doubted me became footnotes in a story that was no longer about them, and in their absence, I discovered the space to become who I was always meant to be. The journey taught me that growth often emerges from the most painful experiences, and that choosing to rise instead of retreat is the greatest act of self-respect. I no longer measure my worth by comparison or approval, but by the life I continue to create with intention and courage. Every challenge faced, every risk taken, and every moment of doubt overcome has shaped a future that feels both meaningful and deeply personal. The past no longer holds power over me, not because it is forgotten, but because it has been transformed into wisdom that guides me forward rather than holding me back. In the end, I learned that the greatest victory is not in seeing others regret their choices, but in realizing that their actions pushed me toward a life I might never have discovered otherwise. I am no longer defined by betrayal, but by resilience, not by loss, but by growth, and not by what was taken from me, but by what I chose to build in its place. And with every step forward, I carry the certainty that my story belongs to me now, shaped by my decisions, my perseverance, and the unwavering belief that I am worthy of the life I have created.